one or an earlier version, but occupation as a movement beyond tactics and not getting attached to tactics, but looking at all, seeing it as a longer term movement than just one occupation, and so on and so forth. Many interesting things that he'll talk about. And I was interested to discover just now that he's published on AnabaptistRadicals.org and UrbanMennonite.org as well.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Without further ado.
Cool. Well, do we need to hook anything up with audio?
We're good.
No.
Don't worry about that.
Okay, great. Hey, everyone. I met Andy through this book that's coming out really soon that I want to pitch. He's got some really great stuff in it, and there's like 50 people in it. It's a big book full of really short essays on tactics and strategy. It's called Beautiful Trouble. And the book release party is April 5th, Thursday, April 5th in Dumbo. Just Google Beautiful Trouble online, and it's going to be really fun. There will be booze there too, if you're into that sort of thing. Hey everyone, I'm glad to be here. I am going to talk a bit about Occupy Wall Street, and then a bit about some of the deeper kind of political behavior-oriented stuff that I've been digging into for the past while. I've been an organizer for 17 years. On a lot of different types of campaigns, from community issues to back the anti-corporate globalization movement, anti-war, working with veterans and things like that. And I'm deeply interested in what motivates us in our social change work, in what gets people to join social movement groups, what gets people to stick with social movement groups. How do groups that maybe didn't start out as a social movement group become politicized and start kind of aligning with the energy of a movement? And I'm really interested in that because I'm not happy with, probably like most people in this room, I'm not happy with the way things are. And I think that to achieve some of the really big changes that I think I'm going to make some assumptions about this audience, that many of us would like to see in our society, we need a lot more what I would call political power. And when I say political power, I'm not necessarily talking about elections. I'm talking about political in the classic sense of power. Social groups aligned that can wield grassroots power to change things. And so that is my little intro of why I'm interested in these dynamics of group dynamics and what motivates us on a group level and an individual level, and how those things can both complement strategy but also be in tension sometimes with strategy. And my hope is that by becoming more aware of some of these different concepts that act on social movement groups, we can navigate them better. And so that's so what's going on here? But last preamble, I'm going to ask questions, and I hope folks will shout things out and participate, even though you're all arranged like an audience. I hope you'll be an active, participatory audience, and I'm going to... Yeah! Thank you very much. And at any point, if you have a burning question, I welcome it, and I might also say, actually, could you hold it for a minute? Don't take that personally. It just depends where we're at in the presentation. But what's going on here? Anyone recognize this?
It's Occupy Wall Street.
It's Occupy Wall Street. Specifically what?
It's a General Assembly of Zuccotti Park.
What's a General Assembly? Someone want to describe a General Assembly real quick?
It's their method for decision-making, collaborative decision-making.
Great, that's one theory. No, just kidding. No, it's one of the mechanisms for decision making. Great, thank you.
Or at least communication about what's going on.
Great, or at least communication about what's going on. Great, what's going on here?
Boo.
Oh, come on, man, have some love in your heart for the drummers. What's going on here? Drumming. What else do you see going on in this photo?
Signs.
And where is this?
The South End Party Park.
Looks like people are having a good time, right?
Yeah.
Party time. Great. So, I'm showing these two things as examples of this basic concept that I didn't invent, but is kind of a building block for some of the things I'm going to get into. Expressive and instrumental. Expressive and instrumental aspects of collective action. So collective action is we're taking action together, and this is a really academic, geeky social movement theory thing, but expressive elements and instrumental elements. Instrumental is we take collective action in order to achieve measurable goals, right? We engage in protests or whatever other tactics, from writing a letter to the editor, to visiting your member of Congress, to protesting, to a strike, to a sit-in, all these things. We do them not just because, but because we want to achieve something. We want to change society, right? Our actions are tactics within strategies, which we hope and hopefully design to result in tangible successes, gains, improvements that affect real people's lives. We're concerned with results. We might evaluate whether our actions are moving us toward making substantial change. That's the instrumental aspect of why we are involved in social movements, in social movement groups, in protests, and different tactics. So, if you're interested in instrumental, you might use this tool called the Tactic Star or other strategy tools to investigate like how a tactic at the beginning, at the middle of this will move forward a specific strategy. What message it will convey. The tone, will it be solemn, jubilant, calm? How will this energy attract or repel people? The timing. Can your tactic be timed to influence with specific political developments? Who is your audience? Is your tactic, and how will your tactic influence your audience? How will it affect potential allies? Will it help you build alliances? Will it not? How will it affect your resources? Will it bring more resources to you? Will it expend more resources than what you really have the capacity to expend? And target. You might have a political target in a specific campaign. So these are all kind of instrumental concerns, right? You evaluate your tactics and your participation in a movement, your movement group for this. The expressive is something that we all know is there, but we don't often name it, right? So we also take collective action because it makes us feel good. And this isn't to denigrate that. Sometimes people do denigrate that because you're like, well, what's it accomplishing, right? You get frustrated that it might not be accomplishing something instrumental, and we denigrate the expressive. But the expressive is important. It's what keeps us motivated. It makes us feel good. Our actions express values. They express our identities and our sense of belonging in a group or in a movement. Expressive aspects of collective action and movement participation are important, right? They feed us. I already said that. Make us feel like we're not alone. When the Iraq War started, for example, folks gathered in cities all around the country, and February 15th was both to stop the war, right? To try to prevent the war, but it was also, we felt like the world was insane, and we came together with other people who felt like us. There's a therapeutic element of it. The warning here is that you can totally fulfill your expressive motivations without ever having to win anything, right? So participation can become this kind of cathartic thing where it feels good, and we might become kind of lazy and lose sight of, hey, actually we're in this to change things. And at the same time, that's not the only reason. We might become overwhelmed with something like how to stop a war, how to change capitalism. These are huge, huge things. And we might lose faith in the ability of collective action to change things and kind of become content to at least have this refuge of people who our values are reflected back to us when we surround ourselves with them. So what might be going on here that's instrumental? What might be going on here that's expressive?
What's instrumental is like a bunch of people are practicing consensus-based decision making, which is like the concrete, like one of the keystones of like a society that a lot of people are trying to build in Occupy Wall Street.
Right. And could that also be expressive at the same
Sure,
time.
yeah, because it's like a big group gathering and everyone's getting together and hanging with each other and feeling respected, I hope.
Yeah, the occupation itself of the park is as an expressive element as well,
Mm-hmm.
as practical.
Can you say more?
Well, just the sheer numbers of people, everyone sitting, listening, being together in a common place. I think it's not too much different from something like a drum circle, but it's just instead of drumming and beating and doing things like that, you're just sitting together and listening to one another. I guess.
Other thoughts on this?
I think when people work hard and have a sense of accomplishment, they want to celebrate too.
Mm-hmm. I think the park has been both in really big ways. It's been really expressive, and that's been extremely motivating to the core of folks and kept people coming back and giving up their lives to be part of this movement. It's that expressiveness, it's that bonding. But then there's instrumental value too, right? In addition to maybe we're making decisions here that might be practical, but we're also like there's some political theater going on here that has some instrumental value, right? Like we're kind of indicting a non-participatory system in this narrative in the media by having this thing where everybody can really visually participate. Sometimes more expressive of our values than functional as a decision-making process, some people might argue. So here, anything expressive, instrumental about it?
Using instruments to express. But yeah, music,
Mm-hmm.
noise.
Well, it's a protest, signs, it's out there to show the public, but also express feelings and music.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so in either of these, can expressive and instrumental ever be in tension with each other in the two examples that I gave?
Most certainly.
Can you say more?
Well, the expression on a drum multiplied by several drums happening at the same time as the General Assembly, as was illustrated before, can collide with each other and sort of make both not happen so well.
Or the drumming at 2 a.m. could collide with the neighbor's interest in sleeping and could undermine some community relation efforts that are part of the strategy too, right? So it's to illustrate that you can't neatly separate expressive and instrumental, but conceptually it's helpful because we can then see how they can be in tension with each other at times. I'm going to quickly show an example that I think is just a really nice example of how these things can go together really, really well. What's going on here?
Foreclosure auction blockade.
Say more. Explain it to somebody who hasn't.
It was one of the first actions of the People's Foreclosure Moratorium in Brooklyn 6 weeks ago, coming out of a couple different activist formations, including Occupy. Folks have decided that they can go to these foreclosure auctions in courthouses in New York, and since in New York, the last stage of foreclosure is when the building is actually sold. If you block the auction where the building is to be sold, whoever's in that building, whether they own it or not, they don't have to leave. And it takes months for the building to get back through committee, through all the filing processes, and back onto the auction block. So it's actually, to talk about these instrumental kinds of actions. This is one of the most instrumental kinds of actions that is being presented right now. And actually, the next one is the first mass action, and it's on Monday at noon in the Bronx. Maybe I can tell you more about that after this. But.
Yeah, and is it also an expressive action?
Sure.
So
Singing.
So what happened here is folks just kept singing.
They kept singing.
So
They got arrested. Some of the folks from Organized for Occupation got their first civil disobedience arrest, and
And that just took up the
and it totally took up all the time. They did it over and over again, and they had to shut it down. In this particular instance, one hot pants broker managed to put enough pressure on the court to have his own little private auction with a group of Hasids in the back room that was not public, because he knew he had a buyer, and he threw a little fit. So we didn't totally shut this one down, but
was there supposed to be many houses auctioned that day?
there were supposed to be a lot, and most of them were not sold.
And in Atlanta, for example, they're doing this too. There they have outdoor auctions, and it's a bit more intertwined in a campaign that is focusing on specific homeowners. So it's like within a strategy, and they've done that as well. It's taken off some other places.
They could really sing.
They could, yeah, and they really practiced.
Yeah.
They really practiced. It's a very disciplined action, and this is kind of a perfect example of something that expresses values. You know, it's that thing that bonds us together, makes us feel like we're expressing our identity, which is a really important part of social change work, but in a way that, instead of alienating us from the rest of society, which I'm going to get into, connects us and helps to further a specific goal. Anyone seen these terms together before? Bonding and bridging? Anyone read Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone? It's a great book. He introduces these. I don't know if he coined them originally, but basically bonding, I won't read all this, but bonding is the idea that we want to connect with the groups that we're a part of, right? It's a part of human behavior. We want to really connect with the groups that we're part of. We want a sense of belonging. We bond by serving each other, by helping each other, by being friends to each other, by listening to each other, and by creating a culture together, by participating in ritual like singing, by signifying our identity with the groups that we're part of. And this kind of signaling behavior is in everything we do. It's in the way we dress. It's in the way we talk. It's in the rituals that we're part of. It's in all this behavior. Everything we do, the groups we're part of, we tend to become more like those groups. It's kind of the conform impulse, but it's grounded in actually some good things. It's like grounded in a sense of belonging, a sense of building together. And bonding really serves important functions. It builds internal solidarity. It meets people's social and often their economic needs, you know, like different cultural groups, different faith communities, all sorts of the groups that we're part of. They serve us, and this bonding really serves important functions. However, one way to bond with a group, or to signal that we belong in the group, is to distinguish ourselves, our groups, from other groups and identities. And so like a real shortcut to connecting with the people I connect with is by like kind of dissing or differentiating myself from other folks. So not to pick on anyone in particular, but like punk rock is a really great example where it's like so many of the expressions are like, I am not like you in this way, and people bond together. But it's not just punk rock. I mean, people on Wall Street signal this belonging with the way they dress and that they're part of this kind of group. But this urge to bond can morph into this really generalized orientation to show how different we are from other folks. And especially if you're a group that's engaged in something that's challenging the status quo, or taking on some oppositional struggle, we tend to then, we can get into this mindset where we're always seeing the differences, where we're like, oh yeah, that thing that other group did, that's so liberal, or that's so this or that or the other thing. I don't know if anyone saw The Life of Brian, but Judean People's Front. We're the People's Front of Judea. This is where some of the sectarianism in social movements comes from. Not all of it, but some of it is a matter of we're connecting with people in this one group, and to do so, we're kind of dissing other groups, or noticing, exaggerating even how different we are from other groups, and sometimes from society itself. And out of this tendency in social groups can come something I call the story of the righteous few, where we stop even imagining ourselves able to win anything because we see ourselves as so alone and so up against the culture that we start not being able to imagine connecting with groups that might not be like us in every way and might not be as radical as us. And we think, well, how will this small little group ever do anything on its own? And we can even start to prize our own marginalization in society, because if society is bad, then it's good when society rejects us, right? We're better. Bridging is about connecting beyond the boundaries of one's social group. To bridge effectively, we have to be oriented kind of in the opposite way of bonding, to translate our values, to find common ground with others. And bridging is essential if we hope to build alignments between groups, between different kind of swaths of society that can accomplish more than our small activist groups can on their own. Feel free to interject at any point if you want to, or like a question, or like oh yeah, that reminds me of such and such. So one of the great things about this 99% thing is that it casts this really wide net in a way that that kind of encourages bridging, right? It's really hard to be like, we're the 99%, screw you. Like it's a really big thing where in this framework, and with the critique specifically that the system's broken and that it's been rigged to serve the very few at the cost of the very large majority. Because of that, we start to be able, that framework helps us to see our struggles in other people's struggles, to see what's happening to teachers in Wisconsin, right? Well, that's what happens when you have a system that's rigged to serve the few against the interests of the many, right? So it encourages this really broad solidarity. The 99% frame, it bridges. It casts an extraordinarily broad net for who is invited to join or connect with the movement. People are encouraged to see their hopes and dreams tied to a much bigger public. It frames a nearly limitless growth trajectory for the movement. Potentially. It's not going to do those things for us automatically, but it creates, as many people have noticed, the Occupy Wall Street movement and the 99% framework have really shifted the national narrative in this dramatic way, and this is part of it. And it's not just this kind of empty signifier, to use the geeky term, that has no content. It might be ambiguous in what it means, but it also really frames this concentration of wealth and political power in our society, which is arguably the central grievance of the Occupy movement and the central crisis of our time. If you look at the past 40 years, it's been really hard to talk about class in any way that gains ground in the culture. And it's, in a very ambiguous way, but it has framed a class conflict, a class struggle, in a way that really is advantageous to our side. It's like you're the 1% and society serves you. So this is to point out that this frame has really helped us as a broad, I hate to use the terms left and right, but I'm going to, a broad left that has been fragmented for decades to suddenly seem a bit more coherent and to be able to bridge.
Okay, but it's still us versus them, right?
It is us versus them. Yeah, you want to say more about that?
That's all.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it really is us versus them. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I like the fact that, like you said, class is becoming it's becoming a concept that's like transformed itself a little bit, but it's still a relevant concept. And like, I was going to ask a question why you don't like to say left and right.
One very quick, specific reason is because I've studied a lot of cognitive science, and when one word is triggered, all the things associated with it are triggered. So when you say right, even though you mean left and right, triggered in the brain is also right, righteousness, correctness, on the right side. Left is left behind, leftovers, out in left field. And so that's one reason. And also a cognitive thing is that once really concrete frameworks that people already know are triggered, it's hard to make those things malleable. Once somebody's defenses, like I might be able to get somebody who's right-leaning to agree with me on a certain issue if I can reach them with different aspects of that issue that appeal to their values. But once that dichotomy that they already have an opinion about is triggered, it's a very difficult conversation. That's my short answer. What?
Also, neither side is popularly appealing. Like, the left is associated with a bunch of like haughty, pompous, liberal douchebags, you know, and people don't understand the idea of like liberatory values versus like conservative, centralized government attitudes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just kind of wanted to add to the us-them kind of binary.
Right.
I mean, I think that the problem with it is that, I think we all kind of respond to it and say, well, that's what the reality is, but I think the danger is that, I can't remember the terms, so if someone remembers this, throw it out there, but I think it's called divergent cleavages, which I know sounds horrible. Well, but it's the idea that for like a society to function healthily, it shouldn't always be the same us and the same them. That you're never going to get rid of that, but there's grounds that cross over in all these different ways, and that feels impossible. You know, where the us and them feels like always us, always them. And
so I do want to say, thanks for bringing that up again, because I wanted to respond to your point. It's a very complicated thing. Just to touch on a couple things, in my opinion, is that people tend to be mobilized by oppositions, and that's a really, really tricky thing, and that can go in really, really bad ways and really pretty positive ways. I think ways that totally demonize the them are really dangerous in society. And you have that possibility with the 99%, 1%, but you also have things like people standing, I am part of the 1% and I'm with the 99%. You know, you're always going to have a 1%, so it's not like an inherently demonized thing. It, to me, is much more of a structural critique that even invites the 1% to redeem themselves and to get on the right side. And to juxtapose with other us-thems, to me, an effective us-them, an effective group narrative is, and group narrative meaning kind of a framing of who is in the group and who's outside of the group. So the 99% frames a really big group, right? And the 1% is outside of the group. Other ways that is done, particularly historically by the right, is often along race, framing the group along race lines, framing the group around nation versus immigrants, framing the group around like normal sexuality versus, you know, deviant. Like there's really negative ways that the us-them tends to be framed by our opposition, and we should learn from that and not repeat that kind of demonization, in my opinion. But that's just to point out that this along economic class is really qualitatively different than the way our opponents tend to use us-them frameworks. And that's not just to congratulate ourselves, but also to help us be conscientious about how we mobilize oppositions.
I will say one more.
Yeah, please.
I made a sign, my only sign I ever made, that said, "We are the 100%." And that was important for me because it's, on one hand, it's a framing strategy. It's all the things you're talking about. On a larger level, it's who are we? We're all in this together. And wouldn't it be nice if that was the goal or the, you know, where we were going? We'll have an argument about that later. But
Yeah, no, I've either seen your sign or someone's sign, and I like them. I like them with the 99% signs too. But yeah, I think.
I mean, I can appreciate the spirit in which you're saying this, but I think the reality is that 1% that's holding on to most of the money is not going to let go of the money voluntarily. And it's not about
I think you're a bad person. It's about, we are entitled to our fair share. We do all the work in this world, you collect all the riches, this is not right. You know, we're gonna do something about it. And it's not about asking them, because they're never gonna give it up without us doing something about it. And what we have is the numbers. We don't have the power, but we have power in numbers, you know. So I think to say, oh, well, we're all in the same world together, it's not really true. They have a different agenda. They have an agenda to hold on to their power. And we have to have a different agenda for that.
We want them to see that we're all in it together, right?
Well, we can talk about this over drinks afterward or down at Union Square, but no, it's actually a great. I mean, it's a great discussion, and I think But I am gonna move on. So I'm gonna geek out on history here for just a second, and wow, 1968. There's like crazy stuff all over the world, right? I think 2 of these are in the United States. One's in France, one's in Germany. Actually, there was like huge, like crazy explosions of social movements in every single highly industrialized society in the world. According to Ron Engelhardt, there was not an exception to this, that it was just like blew up everywhere. The synchronicity of it was phenomenal. It was amazing. And, well, anyone want to venture a guess? Like, why was that?
The dawning of Aquarius.
The dawning of Aquarius, that is a great theory. I wish I knew more about that, but I think probably it's as valid as the theory I'm going to present.
Perhaps the superiority of highly industrialized societies?
Superiority of highly industrialized societies? That's interesting.
Well, I mean, I think you kind of look at like the broadening of education, and you look at this new kind of media construct that's allowing for all of these images and these ideas to be spread rapidly, and also a system that's not aware of how useful they are. Like the police don't understand that an image of a dog attacking someone is incredibly, is rousing for people. The way they do now. Now they get it.
Right. Great. So I think those are all part of it, and there's other things. There's things about capitalism. There's all these different pieces. The one thing I want to present a little bit about here is this guy Ron Engelhardt's theory. And if you want a quick read on it, like there's a shorter book by this guy Bill Bishop. It really deals with Republicans versus Democrats quite a bit more than I would like, but it's really helpful information in terms of what's happened in society over the past 40 years. Engelhardt's thing is based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that's basically the idea that physiological needs come first, then safety, then belongingness and love, then esteem, then self-actualization, self-expression. So, until you've got air, you're concerned about air. Until you have water, you're concerned about water, then shelter, clothes, safety. And basically, according to Engelhardt's theory, a critical mass of the generations in every industrializing society that was roughly the same in economic development, a critical mass of those folks were kind of freed up cognitively to be more concerned with their self-actualization, with their self-expression. And it also had to do with the shrinking of families and all these different pieces. But when this critical mass of this happened, you basically had these explosions of self-expressive people all over the world. And that self-expression happened in many ways. It happened with the countercultural movement. It happened with political movements. It happened in a lot of different struggles. And it's probably overall a very good thing. The complex things and the challenges for us with it are that we've been self-selecting then, since then, and I'm really using general terms here, but we've been surrounding ourselves much more with people who think like us, with people who reflect back to us our values. Bill Bishop in his book, for example, takes zip codes all over the country and religious congregations all over the country 40 years ago, and then now, well, this was a few years back, and looks how how people voted in presidential elections. And the reason he focuses so much on Republican and Democrat is because that's one of the most measurable things consistently. And 40 years ago, it was less than a 20-point spread in 90% of zip codes and religious congregations. So it was less than a 20-point spread between people who voted Republican and Democrat. So communities were heterogeneous, in other words. There was more diversity in any given group. And then it became 90% or more than a 20-point spread. So in other words, we've migrated and we've rearranged our lives in this kind of era of the past 40 years where we are more surrounded by people who think like us, who are into the same things that we're into. And there's some really cool things about that. For example, if you like basketball, I don't really know if this is probably a bastardization of Englehart's theory, but if you like basketball, great. You can surround yourself with more people who play basketball and you can play more basketball, right? You get more of what you want because you're surrounding yourself with people who are more like you. Skiing, great. Punk shows, great. And the rise of the punk movement is clearly like one of these pieces of this generational shift. Activism, great. Except activism has become this arena unto itself, right? It's like civics has, in some ways, been taken out of other aspects of our lives, and punks sometimes are into activism, but I'm into this, I might have an opinion about something, but I'm not an activist. Activism has become a kind of person in the past 40 years, so much so that many of us don't even question that. Like, we're an activist and we'll describe ourselves as that, and that's great. It shows a lot of responsibility, but the problem is, the problem is, surround yourself with a bunch of skiers and you can do more skiing. Surround yourself with a bunch of punks and you can have lots of shows and have a great time. Surround yourself by a bunch of activists and without a relationship to the other groups, to the other aggregations, the other way society organizes itself. And you just have this small group of people who aren't able to accomplish the kinds of changes that we want to accomplish together. And, so this is a poorly done thing, but, we have to be connecting to these other groups. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just think something that brings to mind this thing, like my mom has been in social service her whole life, and she's done a lot of rad stuff in social service. When she was talking to me about this stuff and how I've been involved in Occupy for a while, she was like, so are you going to be some sort of activist for the rest of your life? And I think that highlights this point. Like, she's involved in social change as well, but she sees a huge disconnect between activism and all of this stuff in the streets and blah blah, and the stuff that she's doing, right? So even within something that's seemingly similar, this disconnect is understood.
Mm-hmm. So here's this is not to put anybody down. This guy's probably awesome. But this idea of inoculation is we want to be connecting with these groups, right? With other, social change happens not by building a separate activist space from scratch. If you look at historic social changes, it's never how it's happened. You don't build enough power from scratch in a distinct kind of identity. It's when existing institutions and identities, they might shift along the way, they usually do, but when they kind of come to align with the goals of a movement, and then suddenly you have all these resources and existing social networks going to work for movement goals. If you look at the civil rights movement, for example, obvious example, it was when black churches and black schools, not all of them, but many, notably, came to align so much with the movement goals and to have that kind of buy-in that those that to be a member of many of those institutions came to imply participation in the movement, right? That's when you've got a trajectory of power that really freaks our opponents out. But the problem is if we're not able to bridge between this special thing called activism and these existing identities. When activism becomes its own special project that you kind of have to check your other identities at the door when you enter that arena, and when you enter those other arenas of your life, you check your activism at the door, right? It's this whole thing where society is basically inoculated against the tools and the forms that we need for our own collective liberation, right? And we can often play into this in many ways, which you can imagine. And that's a complicated thing because we are all these different identities. It's a complicated thing of how you connect. But one of the problems, and this is going back to the bonding bridging thing, is when we're bonding in this group that's called activists, right? Or when we're bonding in any aspect of our identity, we're often oriented not to connect. We're oriented toward the opposite. We're oriented sometimes in the story of the righteous few, where we're thinking and emphasizing how special our enterprise is, how different we are from other folks. And we're exaggerating, we might talk about our backward Republican uncle or our backward liberal uncle, depending on what circles we're involved in, right? As a way of kind of signifying that we belong in this group. And that orientation is really the opposite orientation that we need if we're to be organizers and not just kind of a special thing. It's not to say that those things can't accomplish anything. It's not to say activism, as it exists in that way, hasn't made changes and whatnot. But I think what you see over the past 40 years is a fragmentation of the left, of activist groups, where people are working on issues, specific issues, and it's really difficult to bridge and to build a larger movement. And that's something that's so exciting about the potential of the 99% framework and this moment, and one of the reasons I'm so excited. And the term inoculation, what I mean here is that like a virus, if you don't want to be infected by a virus, when you're inoculated against a virus, you inject the host, let's say society, with a really weak strand of that virus, so it builds up an immunity against the virus. And then when anything comes along, it's that immune response is triggered. So, you have all these stereotypes about what activists are, who activists are, pot smoking, latte drinking, there's lots of, none of those things are bad, but there's these stereotypes, and so much so, those stereotypes inhabit such a powerful part of our brain that when you see activism, when most people see it, not most people, when a lot of people see it, it depends what your upbringing is, that whole chain can be triggered, and boom, ooh, I might agree with you, but I'm not an activist. Yeah.
I was wondering, how much of that do you think is the kind of narcissism of activists and activism, and how much of that is just the fact that the general population tends to be basically indifferent and aloof, or they haven't learned how to cultivate their political ideologies, or they maybe don't even know how to affect political change because they've just never learned how to do it, and they've been basically cut off for so long.
Yeah, that's a really hard percentage to gauge. I think it's probably both. I'm glad you used the word narcissistic. I wasn't going to, but it is a thing. It is a thing. Like, activists are often seen to be narcissistic, and sometimes they are. I should say sometimes we are. That different. I started wondering with Occupy, really, we're going to celebrate our birthday every month? And there can be this tendency of hey everyone, look over here, look at me, this is look at this thing, and it can come off as narcissistic, and I do think that triggers a negative reaction in people. And then how much is, I think it's a dynamic. It's a really hard dynamic to break out of. And the reason I'm digging into all this isn't to depress people, but is like hopefully with a little more awareness about it. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest this. We can make our self-expression in our movement happen in a way that connects with people, that bridges instead of isolates. And so, those questions, things like the number of hours people watch television over the past 40 years, like these are all dynamics that have really become constraints in organizing. And it's impossible to say it's this percentage and this and that. But I do think that apathy is really related to disempowerment, though, fundamentally. And maybe this is an article of faith, but I believe that people do want to act on their values. They want to see their values. We want to see our values, reflected around us. We want a better world. And if we don't have the tools to know how to do that, to me, that's where apathy comes from. And so, okay. This is a really geeky term I've coined called the political identity paradox. I call it the problem of movement identities.
Why geeky?
Geeky?
Yeah.
I don't know. Doesn't it just sound geeky, the political identity paradox? Okay, great. That means you and me, we're geeks, I think. That's how I interpret it. Okay, cool. I try to tone down my language, but the problem of movement identities, and it's not just a problem, it's an asset too. But strong group identity is really important for social movements historically. There can't be the kind of serious social movements, the kind that challenges powerful and privileged people without, and systems and whatnot, without a correspondingly serious group identity that encourages at least a pretty substantial core of members to contribute a really high level of commitment, sacrifice, and heroics over the course of prolonged struggle. Now, one caveat that I should have put here is that that's the core. Movements need many, many more times people who are willing to give something, right? Who are willing to give a little something, right? But it also does really, really need a core of people. If you look at SNCC, if you look at all sorts of groups, if you look at the Arab Spring, the role of a core of folks who are willing to give everything, their life, movements need that. And so having a really strong movement identity is critical for that. I believe that without that, it's a rare individual who is willing to act really, really in a huge sacrificial way on their own, outside of the context of a group. It happens. They're saints, but movements shouldn't rely on saints. They should rely on regular people. However, that same strong group identity can be a double-edged sword. The stronger the identity and cohesion of the group, the more likely people, members of the group, are to become alienated from other groups and from the broader society. So the more you construct a distinct culture and a group identity, the more likely, as we talked about bonding and bridging, you are to have barriers kind of come up between your group and the society that you need to be engaging with.
I just thinking a lot about Occupy Wall Street and my experience spending time, and I think I totally agree with everything you're saying, and I'm thinking also that there were a lot of people, core people who kind of fit that role, and then a lot of people who've supported in many ways, including financially, who are on an ego level totally not known, right? Not known by any of the people who were using the money or receiving the food. Completely egoless contributions that, or supporting in different ways. And I just think that's. I don't mean egoless on their part. I mean not recognized or not known. I just think that's kind of important to remember that there may be key people who feel that they are this core group that you're talking about, and they know each other, but they don't know all the other outlining. They don't know them. They don't know them. I don't know how or why that developed in that way.
That's right on. And I think the primary role of the core in social movement group, and I think, to be frank, I think Occupy Wall Street can be in a bit of denial about the fact that there is a core. Like, people don't want there to be a core, but I think having a core is a reality of social change work. And you have to be responsible with that. And to me, the primary role of a core is to facilitate on-ramps and participation of people who can't give up their whole lives. And if we're not oriented to that, the core can actually become a repelling mechanism. The level of sacrifice that the core is willing to give can become a repelling mechanism, because people are like, well, I'm not willing to sleep at the park, or I'm not willing to quit my job, therefore I don't see how I can participate. And too often the core will be like, well, get with the program. Why aren't you willing to get arrested? Why aren't you willing to do this? Why you have such bourgeois values that you're not willing to quit your job? I mean, I'm caricaturizing that, or if that's the right word. But that's because you need a core of people, I believe, but much more important than the core is the huge level of other folks that need to be involved.
But you also bring up money and income, which I think is an incredibly important part of it. Just how are people surviving?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And I'm going to get a little bit to that piece that you just said. So anyway, the political identity paradox states that while social change groups require a strong internal identity in order to foster the level of commitment needed, the same cohesion tends over time to isolate the group. Isolated groups are hard-pressed to build the kind of broad-based power needed to achieve the big changes that they imagine. Oh, framing the hardcore. And this particularly happens in oppositional groups, I believe. That this tendency to because all groups, this is like a sociological phenomenon or a group behavior phenomenon. Groups tend to differentiate and build their own cultures. Groups of identity, it might not be like that oppositional, but like even like your tennis group or your little league soccer team, groups tend to build up their own little cultures and references. It's a human thing. It's a healthy thing. It's a good thing. But oppositional groups are even more prone to differentiate because so much of their identity is in opposition to something. And especially if that opposition becomes more generalized and it's about the status quo and about society itself, then folks are in this thing where you can really become, start differentiating. We're going to get back to this framing the hardcore thing for a second. Well, hardcore, the idea is that in a group, when you have strong identity, Andy, you'll tell me if we're at a weird time thing. Okay, great. I think we're going to go about half an hour and still keep interjecting. I really appreciate that back and forth. When groups, like part of creating a strong group identity is this kind of, groups tend to think, there tends to emerge in groups kind of a hardcore, like a way of like an extreme, kind of a center in the group, like a way of moving toward the center of the group. So for example, well, I'll just give the examples of social movements. Okay, yeah, I'll give an example. What's that? Anyone know? What photo is this?
That's is that Days of Rage?
Days of Rage in Chicago. What's Days of Rage in Chicago?
Bunch of middle-class kids having a riot.
That's one way of putting it. A bunch of middle-class kids having a riot. Dude's wearing a hard hat. And this was SDS kind of becoming the Weather Underground. I mean, this was like where that transition was happening. And when SDS imploded in kind of dramatic fashion, they were growing at a really, really fast rate. They were, 100,000 or more? And at the same time, when they were growing and having this enormous success in terms of their recruitment and their numbers, their leadership was imploding and becoming really, as a trend, disconnected from the broader society because they were developing such a distinct internal group culture, is my explanation in this theory. And people, in order to fit in the group, start signaling like, I'm more hardcore than you, I'm more devoted to the group's principles than you, and those principles became framed as like, you know, declaring all-out guerrilla warfare on the United States government, blowing things up, and folks' reference points became things like the Viet Cong. And, you know, they kind of became encapsulated and really out of touch with where society is at. They misjudged the situation, and, you know, this is basically groupthink happening, where people, and you may or may not disagree with my analysis of the Weather Underground, and that's okay. But this is how hardcore was framed, and this group that was really organizing society, a really important swath of society, the leadership, like some of the smartest folks in other ways, became unable to engage strategically, and some of the folks who could have been some of the best leaders of this generation, some of them did become that, but some of them have been in jail still. And
who were the ones that were able to manage that and who did become the best leaders of that generation? What was their trajectory that they didn't go into bombing things? Just curious.
anyone want to try this?
The only people I know are the people who turn themselves in.
I mean, not everybody became the Weather Underground. There were critics of that direction.
Not everybody became STS. You know, I mean, there was a movement going on. STS was part of it. You know, I think that there was a lot of people from before that time who were around, who were still around, certainly in Detroit, certainly on the West Coast. You know, this was sort of this weird campus phenomenon that could have become something and had the mic for a second, but it wasn't really the core of the movement. You know, the liberatory struggles that were going on then. I mean, really, the Panthers into the BLA was something where you can really, you know, this is the traditionally marginalized and oppressed group, and this is how they framed the hardcore as they moved into the 70s.
I think one of the things with the STS and the Weather Underground, which was just kind of an extreme version of it, it was all based, one, on students, and two, on the draft and the Vietnam War. So when the draft ended, the movement fell apart. It was all around one issue. It wasn't around uniting the students with the working people, with the whoever else. It was all about me, and don't you dare make me die over there. And once the draft was over, it's like, okay, I'm going to become a Wall Street banker. And, you know, they had no core of beliefs other than this one thing.
I would say that largely that's probably true to some extent within the broader movement. I think that the core, the most active folks, actually had some pretty sophisticated analysis and commitment to a whole, I mean, there was like a whole internationalism.
But the reason they were mass movements all around the world.
Right, the conditions really matter in whether we can start a mass movement, that's clear.
And is the hardcore a question of tactics? Like, is that judged by whether you're willing to bomb something or carry a shotgun?
Right,
or
great.
Is it a question, or is it another kind of dynamic? Because from what I hear you say, then it's a question of tactics. Then the entire Black Panther Party would fit under a kind of definition of what that would be hardcore, and I actually don't think that's the case. So is it a question of adopting tactics that are kind of in breach of convention and the law, and that sort of situate themselves in a certain kind of opposition to a state apparatus, or is it something else?
So that's a great transition to the next slide, and I think the hardcore is actually something that happens in a lot of groups. It happens on sports teams, people being like, I mean, most dramatic example would be like the rugby players who never mind, like people who do.
Not all like frat boys are rapists, but the hardcore are because they're.
Well, with fraternities like hazing things, right, or different initiation rituals, right, could be part of this hardcore. But I don't think the hardcore is inevitably a bad thing. I think the hardcore is like a way of signaling you really belong in this group. Like, you really belong in this group. You're willing to do such and such. And anyone know what's going on here? This is people being registered to vote in the South by Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I just want to juxtapose for a minute what SNCC was doing, even though there's lots of other factors that are different, but what SNCC was doing and what was going on with STS. And there's a lot to pick apart in that, but just with this one particular thing, within SNCC, the hardcore was framed, there was a hardcore in the group, and it was going into some of the most dangerous areas in the South where, most of the initial leadership of SNCC was northern people, northern black people. And that was a very different dynamic. Like, there was a huge class divide among a lot of folks. Like, learning to talk outside and to organize the constituencies that people were organizing, it wasn't just like, it was not a cakewalk. It was really hard for folks. And people like Bob Moses and Ella Baker really framed what it meant to be hardcore. In the group, to be hardcore was like getting out of your comfort zone, talking to people who you're afraid to talk to, going into dangerous areas, organizing. And that's that was how you kind of participated, and it was framed in this really specific way. Whereas here, the most kind of extreme tactics started to become the way to signal belonging, and with very, very different results. And there's a lot of things to compare, but the idea here is they're within Occupy often, for an example. Sometimes like the next thing that comes along as like the tactic that like is really cool is like the thing that's on the radar becomes a thing that gravitates the most energy. And what that is and whether it is kind of designed to like show how different you are from society or show how like extreme you are, or whether it's designed to like actually connect and to further specific issues is a pretty important question. Henry, you had some thoughts on this question back when, and I want to your reply to my article when I sent it to you.
Well, I was sitting here thinking about the difference between SNCC and SDS and the Panthers and things like that, and I'm not exactly sure if I'm following my cue here. So cue me up.
All right. Well, we don't have to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the nod.
Yeah. So and I don't know if but I'm not seeing as many. Yeah. Go ahead.
So kind of where I see this is like, if you go back to that other picture, whether this dude in the middle is like a leader of this or not, I just think it's interesting that like the center of the picture is this like white dude who is like also the most privileged person in our society, right? And like also like the least likely to face major persecution in like the prison industrial complex, right? And like, since he's a white dude, he's less likely to have like have been like sexually assaulted, right? So all of those things, like not having those things makes it easier for you to be in like a big, loud, rowdy group setting where people are like smashing stuff, right? And so I guess what I think of when I think of all this is how like really radical movements tend to idolize like tactics that are hyper intense and like really violent and audacious and all this stuff. But those are isolating like inherently because like if you have a trauma history, like all that stuff is super triggering, like loud noises and smashing of stuff and all that. If you're like more likely to serve lots of time in prison because you're black, and that's like just a fact of the prison industrial complex, then that's like isolating. And that's not saying that people with trauma histories or people of color, like those people take like extreme actions like this too. But this is like, at least in my experience, the people who take on actions like these that I've seen tend to be people who are like more privileged in society, and so it's like inherently exclusive. And so when you say that this is like the best thing that we can do, like this kind of like aggro stuff is like the best and the coolest, then you are inherently like isolating people who have structural barriers to it, participating in that.
Actually, I think that's a good point you bring up, is that they were privileged and they didn't have the fears that somebody poor and black maybe would have about going to prison and, daddy isn't going to bail me out, for instance, or, like what happened with the Chicago 7. It was the black guy who really got dumped on, But also, I think you have to remember also another role of those who are pushing towards violence. A lot of them were police agents who were trying to destroy the group from within, and that was a very effective method they had. They were called agent provocateur, and what they did was they provoked you into the most extreme, and then that was the end. Everybody got arrested, and it destroyed the leadership. And it was not just on a little level; it was on a huge level. They were infiltrating these groups in the thousands, the police and the FBI.
And one other piece of this, and one possible way of explaining some of the differences here that have to do with privilege. You tend to groups tend to make this kind of hardcore thing, and I saw this when I've been working with some of the groups with Occupy Homes, went out to Minneapolis and to Atlanta over the past couple weeks, and there's some real great cores of people organizing, and they're really grounded in a very specific goal of saving very specific people's homes. They also save the church, like they're doing this great stuff. And so having a really specific goal, I think, tends to orient people in much more practical ways. And having a specific goal of registering voters, for example, as opposed to, part of it is the issue people are taking on, and these are really complicated things. Like, how do you stop a war? That's very difficult.
But you're kind of comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah, that's,
that photograph with the voter registration photograph. There's something that if you want to do a kind of comparison of like white radicals at that moment and black radical movements, that's not the right comparison. That seems kind of rhetorically, that's a rhetorical device, but it doesn't hold water.
Well, SNCC was.
Yeah, but
I'm going to do 1, 2, 3.
yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what I was taking from this was that the hardcore does not necessarily have to turn into a violent thing. You said that like group dynamics, seem to lead to a building of intensity at the center, but it's possible that perhaps the building of intensity can lead to something like this. Rather, it doesn't, and I agree with what you said with the green shirt. Like, I agree that happens most of the time, but maybe it doesn't necessarily have to. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, that's actually an essential point. Thank you. That this idea of hardcore is that within a really committed group of people with a strong cohesive identity, there is an urge to do more. Like, it arises, this kind of urge to escalate, an urge to take it to the next level. That tends to arise in social movement groups, and how that manifests can be really, really consequential. If it, manifests, here is one way of it manifesting, here's another. I agree it's apples and oranges. I do agree with you. That, like, it's not like that's the only factor.
It's voter registration. The goal might be something else, change the world or end a war, or the Panthers had a very different goal from this. They wanted real more equality, not, registering for a vote. I don't want to insult people, but maybe in a way that was the wrong direction to go. Because if you think the vote is going to help you, look at where black people are today compared to where they were there. They're not that much better off economically, but they're voting, okay.
To SNCC's credit, like, voter registration was one of many, many things that SNCC did. And it was a tactic for building societal transformation. But
I was just going to say that, I completely agree about comparing, the two images, but I think it's helpful in kind of looking at how this, like, performance of the hardcore affects how the barriers from outside to inside are affected. Where even just in this image, there's still an order. They're in line, people are sitting, they're all facing a direction to some kind of authority, even if it's in their own meeting. Like, there's some kind of semblance of hardcore is being performed as how persistent are you, how respectful are you? Where in the other image, it's all about, it's how aggressive can you be, how confrontational can you be? And, I think that it's important to be aware of that that how that hardcore is being performed and received on the other side, and whether that's a barrier or an invitation.
I mean, it's also kind of oh, sorry.
I just think hardcore is essential, right? If you look at any of these movements, you compare them, the hardcore element has got to be there. People who are really dedicated, they're self-sacrificing. Ideally, they're heroes, right? In the case of SDS, I think that, while they weren't homogeneously white and they weren't homogeneously middle class, there was a lot of that, and so they were operating in something of a vacuum. They weren't accountable to the people who are most affected by social unease or inequality at that time. They came up with some screwy ideas and executed them. It didn't really work out, right? But it's not whether or not the tactic is pacifist or violent or whatever, because in Denmark, the Danes were bombing the Nazi trains, and in South Africa, they were blowing up infrastructure belonging to the Boers and the whites there, So, but then also, the hardcore for the Black Panthers, the guns thing was only was a media spectacle. It wasn't about arming the population. That was part of it. There is the Fifth Amendment, the First, Second Amendment, whichever one. The right to keep and arm bears is really important, but
Right to bear arms.
but I think that, but they were also, hardcore was also, being willing to sacrifice some of the glamour in that group and do the sickle cell anemia clinic and serve the breakfast, especially as they escalated. And it was only because they were so effective and so crushed by the FBI that they ended up with this eventual formation where a lot of them joined the Black Liberation Army and, made some decisions regarding that, but they were never really demonized on the left the same way the weather was demonized on the left. The Weathermen were in a really screwy situation where they were in this really awesome organization. They had all this political power, and then all of a sudden, a lot of the people within the power structure wanted to demonize the Viet Cong, who were the victims of U.S. imperialism at the time. And so they were left the most hardcore. The authors of Prairie Fire, which was all about sex and race equality and things like that, were left with this decision of they were going to have to get the hell out. And so they were kind of angry, and they led the way to make some stupid decisions and eventually led the way out of relevance, But there's a lot of ways to frame the hardcore with a lot of different tactics, and you just got to be paying attention to the people who are most affected to figure out what hardcore looks like in a way that's relevant.
So I'm gonna say another comment and then wrap up and open to about 10 more minutes of. If you ever want to hear about narrative insurgency, ask me. We're going to skip that tonight. But I want to say a couple wrap-up comments and then open it up to a little bit more discussion. The idea, and I'm sorry if my presentation of it initially seemed confusing with the hardcore thing. The idea is that within groups, within movement groups, especially within the core, the most active participants, there is a tendency to really bond. There's this political identity paradox where you need that bonding, you need that having each other's back, you need that support, but there's a tendency with that to become alienated from the broader society, especially in an oppositional movement. And there's a tendency within groups to want to up the ante, want to really show one's commitment to the group and to the group narrative and whatnot. And that can be framed in a way that kind of tweaks the whole thing, like it happened in SNCC, where a tendency that could make people bond at the expense of bridging and connecting with other people, that way of showing that you belonged in the group was framed as get out of your comfort zone, go talk to strangers, go door to door. And to be part of the group implied those things. So it took this kind of inward-facing tendency and just flipped it in this kind of brilliant way, where to really be part of the group, to be, belong in the group, you had to be oriented to connect outside of it. And that doesn't happen in a lot of groups. And this is a dynamic that I think Occupy Wall Street is wrestling with. So that's the basic idea. And then the expanding the us is this piece, getting back to this bridging thing, that Occupy Wall Street's been this amazing moment where I think a lot of self-selectors came out of the woodwork, people who were waiting for this moment and stepped up, and people have sacrificed in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of levels and a continuum. But that self-selection, I think, has hit a plateau where the folks who are going to get involved that way as individuals, kind of stepping up, self-selecting, has plateaued. And the next moment is some of the organizing work that is never replaceable historically, and that might have seemed that way for a moment with Occupy because it was a really exciting moment. They hit the target right. Folks came out of the woodwork, shifted the narrative, but at this point we have to give on-ramps to not just individuals but the whole constituencies, and to repoliticize kind of the fabric of our society and expand who is Occupy Wall Street, or expand who is the 99%, expand who identifies or who actively aligns with this movement. And that takes a lot of work. It takes recognizing that there are tons of groups, community groups, faith groups, whatever, unions, who have been doing really important work that aligns with this completely for a long, long time, and learning from that and not having like a messiah complex of like, we invented, the idea of a social movement. And a humility that sometimes isn't there. But to enter those relationships, and these are just a couple of great examples. There's Occupy the Hood. This is Bobby Hall from Occupy Homes, whose house was saved in Minneapolis. This is Occupy Faith. And Occupy, just real quick, and then I'll wrap it. I can speak more. I've been involved with these two pieces. Occupy Faith, the conversation that they're having right now is really exciting. It's like, we went to the park with this golden calf. It was great. We did this as clergy. But we need ways for our congregations to be involved as a congregation. Like, that's how this movement's going to grow, is not by like us going down to the park just as individuals, but by finding some expression for our congregation to take together. And Occupy Homes is one way that some congregations have been doing that. For example, they've been doing fellowship meals in Atlanta, where a congregation gets together with a family that's being foreclosed, and they do something that's really within the experience of that group, a fellowship meal. Maybe more is needed, right? But that's an on-ramp. That builds investment, it builds buy-in, and that's the way we grow social movement. So it's an exciting time where we can really expand this and grow. I like to look forward to thinking back 20 years from now as Occupy Wall Street as like a big catalyst to like decades of a stronger social justice movements, right? This is my optimistic side. But to get there, we have to build those on-ramps. And we're not going to do it if we're super proprietary about the memes that we've created, about Occupy, about the 99%. If we say like that group that's doing that thing with the 99%, well, screw them. They're not as radical as us, right? That's a complicated question. Co-option is a real thing that we have to wrestle with. But anyway, I've rambled on enough. I'd love to hear some thoughts without me responding, just for you all. And we'll go another 10 minutes. If you have to leave, go ahead and leave. But otherwise, I'd love to hear folks' thoughts.
Just some of the things I was thinking about when you were talking before, the idea of the, who gets involved. There's also a gender aspect of that, and also, different issues of disability as well. Who could actually sleep, in a park for some period of time. It's one thing. And the other thing I'm thinking about is that we're having this conversation in an academic setting. So what does it mean that, a lot of folks who are involved come with a lot of theory, and a lot of their experience possibly coming from classrooms. Where does the whole issue of, adjunct professors and tenure and all these things that are going on inside of the academy around class and the bubble of, student debt, and there's so much about how, the university is often a place of a lot of radicalism looking out, but not so much looking at itself. And also that, reaching out, if we're using certain kinds of jargon that other folks don't understand, we might not be able to communicate with people. And we might think that they're not smart because they don't understand our jargon, and we might miss that they have a lot of wisdom that we need, right? Because especially learning in an academic setting, we can miss things. The other thing I keep thinking about is the camera as a filmmaker, and you know, down at Zuccotti Park there were so many cameras, and I also have to wonder about that. You know, we've become so accustomed to sort of being filmed all the time, and not, I don't know what's going to happen to this video, and what does it mean to be sort of putting oneself out into the world without necessarily giving permission. So I actually would love to know what this is being used for, but I think that that's a big part of this, is this sort of hyper documentation of these movements, and I'm curious what will happen with all that. So anyway, these are just random thoughts. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. We're filming all the lectures in this series, and we're making a book out of them. That's kind of about Occupy Wall Street, seen through eyes like those and the audiences. Sort of.
A book, but not a video. But you're filming them to.
Well, yeah. I mean, it might be online, and have the video embedded in it as well.
Yeah, but it's true, you didn't get
I
anyone's
didn't
consent.
No, it's
Yeah.
true. It's true.
So I don't give my consent.
Okay.
It's me on the film, so.
All right.
you
Or
might
I
have
would,
asked.
I would love to know if I was
Yeah.
going to be, and that's not about you guys. I love your work, but
Yeah.
it's just this sort of larger context that we're in, right?
Yeah.
Where
No.
I
think at the beginning we asked-
one might.
We asked for permissions from people, and then we've gotten lazy about it. So we should still be doing that. So sorry.
That's okay.
I guess one thing I just kind of wanted to tie from the beginning. The thing is that I think that the other side of this, kind of like the powers that be, and I'm going to try to make this really quick, but I mean, I think they're incredibly adept and aware of these limits and dynamics, and also how to institutionalize them to make it harder to jump over. So, for example, like, there's, I mean, one of my favorite artist talks is kind of about essentially just how, once, in the late 90s, once the authorities and powers that be figured out how group dynamics and all these things work, essentially set up this system where it's reductive to be only expressive. Well, all right, let's set up this system where people can get permits to have a march, and now we're going to set up these barricades, so there's this space that's here and separate from these people, and you can't get beyond that. And the MTA is going to have a strike. Well, let's set up this system so that people can take take cabs, so that way the effects of it aren't as felt. Let's not tax people during a war. So like, the logic is incredibly adept on the other side, and I don't know. I just think it takes so much awareness on our side to really try to proactively, understand how strong they are and how aware of all of this they are.
And just real quick, that's why I'm like doing these presentations, and kind of to respond to your point, like, this is not externally oriented language. This is like figuring out the mechanics of how our groups work so that we can navigate some of those dynamics. It's a very internal conversation that all are welcome to, but and it's also not, I'm honored that you might think that I'm from academia, but I studied this while organizing on my own.
Yeah, and I think what you raise, and I think which are the limits of really kind of behavioral psychology and the models that I think you use to frame your understandings of this, is that one, what they really obviate and they don't allow is an understanding that's based on the relationality of what happens to movements with the forces that oppose them, which is what you just raised. And so I understand that there's some minimal value in understanding that in any human group there's leadership, and as that group gets more complex, leadership diversifies in different directions, right? So it's about the hardcore as a question of leadership and how that develops in human groups. And psychology and those models has something to tell us about that. But what they don't really allow us to see, and the dynamics, which I think is where the politics lie, is really the place at which social movements and human groups in general, but particularly social movements and political movements, really develop and fragment in response, in this very kind of relational kind of moment with the forces that oppose them, and the kinds of repression that confronts them, and the kinds of infiltration to which they're subject, and all of those kinds of things, right? And so in a sense, one can see kind of the SNCC photograph and the Days of Rage photograph, that might make sense and be coherent in a context where kind of the relationality kind of allows you to understand how those things developed in relation to the forces that they were confronting, rather than the internal group dynamics, which is what those sort of behavioral psychological models really focus on and create these really discrete kind of bounded entities that then they attempt to explain. And I think in a sense that's where those models, not only in the understanding of politics and social movements, but really in kind of the contemporary social sciences, really don't hold that much water anymore.
Yeah, I think that, and I want to hear, just give a chance for anybody who hasn't spoken to talk yet, but just to name that, you're talking about the subjective and the objective conditions, right? Like the subjective being like the internal group dynamics, and then there's the society.
Right, but that's
and,
right, but that's
and they're not separate. They're not neatly separable, and that's absolutely important. And your apples and oranges and the critique of the way I use those examples, I think, is absolutely valid. However, the subjective is often the thing that we have the most power to shift. However, we can't just do that without an analysis of our particular context. Right on, totally important. That like these dynamics play out differently in different contexts, and like the political moment, whether there's a draft, whether there's
But even repression.
yeah,
I'm talking
levels
about
of
social
repression,
movement.
all these things.
Like, you know, the harder the cops come down, the more radicalized certain sectors get.
Yep.
I mean, you know, we're talking, I mean, and this is, I found also you're talking kind of, the generalizations you make very national, very American.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think that there's kind of more experience that actually can kind of feed onto this stuff of contemporary and in the past. But the dynamics, I mean, you know, orders are given to cops to beat for a variety of reasons, and some of those reasons can be to generate hardcores tactically that will enable them to portray violence and therefore escalate and allow them to sort of sell a law and order option and a zero tolerance option. And that's, I mean, and that's not even to account for infiltration, which we know that there are people rattling barricades that they're not all on our side in Occupy Wall Street. So it's in the broader sense in which you just named it, but it's also in the really tactical sense of how the trajectory of movements and the decisions made in movements and the opinions and actions that win out arguments and actually happen in movements get refracted and framed by the way in which the state responds to
Yep, I think that's right on. Anyone who hasn't spoken yet, or who maybe just spoke once, who wants to contribute? Not that you're not contributing by just being here and listening, but I just want to make sure that we have a chance for everybody to talk. Well, thank you, everybody. Oh.
Yay!
And thanks for the feedback and the dialogue. Really appreciated the chance to be here.
Yay!